I paint with my airbrushes every single day, so I want to make sure that they're always clean and performing properly. So in this week's video, I'm going to show you the techniques that I use to keep my airbrushes clean. That's what I do before I start painting, what I do while I'm painting and switching colors, and then finally how I clean it at the end of the day, which takes 2, maybe 3 minutes at the most. So for the first tip, what I do before I start painting. Now I only use water-based acrylic paints, and I like to mix and reduce all of my paints outside of the airbrush. I use these 1 ounce or 2 ounce plastic cups, and the main reason that I mix outside of the airbrush is that it allows me to save my paint mixtures so that I don't need to reduce or mix my paints every time I start a session. I know that a lot of people like to mix and reduce their paints within their paint cup, and there's nothing wrong with that if that's the way that you like to work. The problem for me though is that it just gets very messy, especially if you're back flushing your colors. Instead, what I do and what I recommend doing is picking up some of these 1 ounce cups. You could buy them in bulk, you could even clean them when you're done, they'll last a very long time. And after I reduce my paint like I did here, I can store it by placing the cap on so it doesn't dry out, and then for longer term storage, I'll add it into one of these 1 ounce dropper bottles. And then when it's time to start painting, my color is ready to go, I have the right mixture, I have the right reduction, and I know in most cases that I'm not going to need to fill the whole cup up with paint. So instead what I'll do is use a pipette like this one and add as much paint to the airbrush as I need, which in most cases isn't that much. And so when I'm done at the end of a paint session, it's really only the very bottom of the paint cup that I need to clean out, and most importantly, I'm saving a lot more of my paint this way because I'm only using what I need. So from here, let's move on to actually painting with the airbrush. There's one part of my airbrush that I clean constantly as I'm working, and it literally takes like a second or so. That's the tip of the airbrush needle. As you're painting with your airbrush, a small amount of paint is going to cling to the end of the needle tip, and then the air flowing over that needle tip is going to start to dry it out, and this is called tip dry. If you're using acrylic paints like I do, tip dry tends to build up on the needle tip pretty quickly, as you can see in this macro shot at 120 frames per second. This dried paint on the needle tip is going to restrict the path of the paint flowing from the nozzle, and you may start to notice that your airbrush is not spraying properly anymore. And so all you need to do is clean the paint off and you can go right back to painting normally. And I clean the tip of my airbrush needle so often that I never have problems with tip dry because I just don't let it build up. I clean tip dry off a few different ways, and the technique that I use most often is I just pinch the dried paint off with my fingertips. I do this so often that I don't even realize I'm doing it anymore. Every few minutes when I stop one part of the painting to decide what I'm going to paint next, I just pinch off any dried paint. But you need to be very careful here because that needle tip is very sharp. You don't want to stab your finger with it, and you don't want to bend the needle either. So another way that I like even better is to use a brush to clean it off, and I'll use either a paintbrush or a soft toothbrush wetted with some water or some cleaner and gently wipe off the tip of the needle. A Q-tip or a cotton swab is also a popular option, but the reason that I really like a brush is because it not only removes the tip dry, but it also cleans off the end of the nozzle cap or the air cap, and this is very important. You want that air passage around the nozzle to be cleared of any sort of dried paint so that the air can freely and evenly spray over the tip of the nozzle and the needle. Now it's not blocking the air passage here, but you can see that some paint is already starting to accumulate and dry on the nozzle cap, so when I wipe off the tip dry, this paint gets wiped off as well. It just takes about 1 second to do, and another nice thing about the brush is that it also works well if you keep your needle cap on to protect the needle tip. Just make sure that when you wipe this off with a brush that you point your airbrush in another direction from your painting and press down to spray air. The reason I'm telling you this is that because a small amount of that liquid usually stays on the tip of the needle or the nozzle cap, and you don't want any of this getting onto and ruining your work. So just point your airbrush in another direction, press down to spray air, and any liquid on there is going to get blown off. Now clogs do occasionally happen, but before I even think of breaking anything down, what I like to do is point my airbrush onto a scrap piece of paper. Then I'll press down on the trigger, fully pull back just for like a half a second, flush anything out, and then I'll clean the needle tip off and the nozzle like I just showed. If you're using a good airbrush paint like I'm using, most of the times what I'm sure is a clog is usually just tip dry that I didn't fully clean off. And one last thing before moving on to color changes, if you notice that your airbrush is building up a lot of paint on the needle tip or that it spatters every time that you press down on the trigger, it might be because you're releasing the trigger and the air in the back position. So it's important to use good trigger technique, and that's pressing down so that the airbrush sprays air and then pulling the trigger back to start spraying paint. And equally important is to push the trigger fully forward to stop the paint, and only then do I lift my trigger finger up to stop the air. When I use this trigger technique, the air continues to flow over the needle tip so that as I move it forward, it blows off any excess paint, which helps to slow down the buildup of tip dry. But now if I lift my trigger finger up in the back position, you'll see here that the air stops at the same time and didn't blow off any of that excess paint on the needle, and I'm left with a big glob of wet paint. And if I left it like that, it's going to dry on that needle tip and restrict the path of the paint flowing from the nozzle. And if I forget that it's there while it's still wet, the next time I press down on the trigger, that wet paint is going to spit or spatter on whatever surface I'm aiming the airbrush at. To avoid all this, just remember to push the trigger fully forward to seal off the nozzle before lifting your finger up to stop the air. It's a bit of muscle memory, but it's really easy to get down. So the next thing up is color changes, and let's say that I want to switch colors from the black that's in my airbrush right now to this Prussian blue that I already have reduced and added into a dropper bottle. I always like to have one of these food containers with paper towels in it next to me while I'm painting so I can use this to dump out any excess paint. And what I do is tilt my airbrush over this container and I use one of these squeeze bottles to rinse out any paint within the cup. Now I have distilled water in here because I also use this to reduce my paints, but regular tap water is perfectly fine for this. So you'll see that I'll just squeeze this water in to flush everything out of the cup, and I'll also fill it up a few times and dump it out into this container to get the majority of the paint out of that cup. And then to spray out the remaining paint within the airbrush, I'll bring in one of these spray out pots, add some more water into the cup, and then spray it until it runs clean. And then I'll just do this a few times, maybe 2-3 times, add a little bit of water into the bottom of the paint cup, spray it out. And for me, in most cases, that's usually clean enough for the next color, and I'll add it right into the cup just like this. But now, if I don't want any contamination from the previous color to the next, like maybe I'm switching to a white or in between complementary colors, then I'll just add a bit more water into this cup and then use a heavy-duty paper towel or a shop cloth to wipe the paint cup out clean. And then to be careful to avoid any dried paint from the walls of the cup or fibers from that shop cloth getting into the airbrush, I'll give it another quick rinse with water, and just like before, I'll fill the cup up a few times and dump it out. I spray out the remaining water into this container, and now this airbrush is clean enough for the next color, and I don't have to worry about contamination from the previous color. So using this dropper bottle, I'll add a few drops of this Prussian blue into the airbrush, and again, just a few drops, only what I need. And then on a scrap piece of paper, I'll prime that paint by pressing down on the airbrush trigger and pulling back about 1/4 of the way until I see the paint flowing and the airbrush atomizing it properly. With that wet paper towel, I can also use it to clean off the top of the dropper bottle before putting the cap back on. This way I don't have to worry about dried paint from the paint bottle getting into my airbrush the next time I need to use this color. I also like to use that paper towel to wipe off any paint from the outside of my airbrush that may have gotten on it during that color change. It's just so quick and easy to do when the paint is wet, and I know that I'm not going to have more work to do at the end of the day cleaning off dried paint. So from here, let's move on to the final part. That's how I clean my airbrush at the end of a paint session or at the end of the day. And you're going to see that it's a very simple process and it only takes a few minutes to do it the most. This is my cleaning setup. It's pretty much everything that I showed before, like the spray out pot, some shop cloths, and a food container, and if needed, some large paintbrushes to clean out some stubborn paint that I can't get with the paper towels. I use water for most of my cleaning, but at the end of the session or the end of the day, I love to use this airbrush cleaner as well, and I add it into one of these squeeze bottles so I can easily squirt it into my paint cup just like I do with the water. And if you haven't used one of these types of bottles, you're missing out because it's an absolutely amazing tool to rinse and flush out the airbrush. It's definitely something everyone should invest in. I always have 2 of them. One is filled up with the airbrush cleaner, the other is filled up with water. And again, regular tap water is just fine for cleaning, so I start the same way as I do with my color change. I use a squeeze bottle with the water in it to flush out all the paint within the cup, then I fill it up a few times and dump it into the container. Then like before, I'll add some of that water into the paint cup and spray it out. I'll do this a few times, and it's just water, so don't be cheap with it. Rinse it out, flush it out as much as you can. After I spray out all that water, I'll add some more into the cup and quickly back flush it by pinching the needle with my left hand and pressing down and pulling back on the trigger with my right. I'm not a big fan of back flushing for mixing paint just because it gets messy, but I do really like it for cleaning at the end of the day, and I'll just do this for a few seconds with that water. I'll spray out the rest of it and then I'll add some more water and use one of these shop paper towels to fully clean out the paint cup. I probably spend about 5 to 10 seconds with the paper towel to fully wipe down the walls of the cup and remove as much paint as I can. Then when I'm done, I want to make sure none of that dried paint or possible fibers from the cloth get into the airbrush, so I'll fill it up a few more times with water and dump it out. I also like to hold the airbrush on its side and rinse water through the cup like I'm showing here. It's kind of like irrigating the paint cup out. I do this just to make sure that no fibers or dried paint got into my airbrush. And then I spray out the rest, and you can see how clean I'm able to get my paint cup by using water only. And then to finish this up, I'll do the same thing with some of that airbrush cleaner instead of the water. I'll add some to the cup, back flush it for a few seconds, and then spray it through. And to make sure that I got all the paint out of my airbrush, I can test on a scrap piece of paper to make sure that that cleaner is spraying clear. And if it's not, I'll just use more water and repeat the first steps. You'll see here that when I test this cleaner on a blank piece of paper, it sprays clear. So I know that the airbrush is clean, there's no paint left in it. I'll wet a paintbrush with some of that cleaner by dipping it into the cup, and then I'll wipe down the nozzle and the needle tip just like I showed earlier in this video to make sure that I remove any paint that might be left. And then finally, one last rinse with water so that none of that cleaning solution mixes with any of my paint the next time I use my airbrush. Now that I know that the airbrush is fully cleaned out of paint, I can take the needle out to see if there's any dried paint on it. There's just a little bit on this one, so I'll give it a quick wipe with a paper towel and some airbrush cleaner. And that's my entire cleaning process. It takes me a few minutes at the end of each day, and all my airbrushes are always clean using this technique. They're ready to go the next time I need to use them. If I notice that the dried paint in the cup is a bit stubborn and difficult to remove, I'll add some of this cleaner into the cup, then I'll press down, pull back on the trigger just to get that cleaner into the airbrush, and then I'll let it soak in there for a short amount of time, maybe 2-3 minutes. This is going to help break up and loosen any of the paint within the walls or within the airbrush. This airbrush cleaner is pretty incredible. It does a great job at loosening up dried paint, especially if you let it sit there for a few minutes. Then I can come back in with a paper towel and wipe the rest of that paint out. Another popular option is using a large synthetic paintbrush, and it works very well, but you need to be very careful so that the ferrule here doesn't scratch the inside of your paint cup. So for me, I just mainly use the paper towels. And then just like I showed before, after I finish using the cleaner, I give it one quick rinse with water to make sure I get all that cleaner out of my airbrush. After a few months or years of painting with your airbrush and cleaning it out, don't ever get worried if you notice some discoloration at the bottom of the paint cup. All it is some of that chrome wearing off, exposing the brass of the airbrush, and the airbrush is still perfectly smooth inside and will work normally. So to finish this video up, I'm just going to go over a few bonus tips that I use all the time. I own a lot of airbrushes, so let's say that I'm finished cleaning this airbrush and I know that I'm not going to be using it for a few months. I'm going to place it in storage. What I like to do is remove the rear handle, loosen up the needle chucking nut, and then slightly retract the needle before tightening that chucking nut back down. I actually learned this from Badger because this is what they do before they ship out all their airbrushes to prevent any accidental damage to the needle tip. It's a great little trick, and it's the way that I store all my airbrushes that aren't going to be in use for a while. Then before I start painting again, I'll loosen up that needle chucking nut, gently push the needle forward to seat it. And I know that the airbrush was properly cleaned before I put it away, and I'm confident that the needle is still perfectly straight. And my final tip, this is one that I use every day. If I'm working on my painting and I need to take a break, like maybe I need to walk the dog or get some dinner, I'll rinse out and dump any of the paint that's in my airbrush. Then I'll fill up the paint cup with some distilled water, press down, pull back on the trigger to get that water into the airbrush, and then cap the top of it. This way, if there's any residual paint within the cup or the airbrush, the water is going to prevent it from drying out. And then when I get back in an hour or so, I dump out the water, spray out the rest, add paint to my airbrush, and get right back to painting. I never soak or submerge my airbrush in water. I just do this for a short break, maybe an hour or so, make sure that no paint is drying out my airbrush. And then at the end of the day, I go over what I just did. I spend 2 to 3 minutes to rinse everything out with a ton of water, and I also use some of that airbrush cleaner to remove the dried paint. There's no disassembly required here, and I'm confident that all my airbrushes are always going to be clean and ready to go. Everyone has their own little cleaning routine, but this is the one that I use daily, and I hope that it might be helpful to some of you guys watching. And thank you so much for being here, and I wish you nothing but the best in your paintings. And before I go, just like always, I want to say thank you so much for the very generous support of the current channel members. I'd also like to welcome Oak, The Man, and a welcome back to Reagan and Hangel 1986. Have a great week, everyone. I'll see you back here next Friday.